Hi, this is Micah Long, and today I'll be going through a simple approach to reviewing blood gases. Not a big physiology review, but just the idea that with a little bit of guidance and an outline to follow, it's quite simple to go through and interpret blood gases. This is me. I'm a critical care anesthesiologist, and I started this lecture and assorted educational teachings like my YouTube channel, ICU Dad, in hopes of teaching people detailed concepts of medicine and physiology in a really simple way. I also blog every once in a great while on icudad.com. Thanks for listening. I do not give a lecture on detailed blood gas physiology. I leave that to the smart nephrologists. What I do, however, is teach a very practical approach to blood gas interpretation that is stepwise and enables you to take something that has a lot of data in it and have an approach to simplify it and be able to do that on rounds. I also will review the basic approach to each step, like the compensation ratios. We'll talk about the delta gap and then go through some practice, equations, and examples. My stepwise approach is pretty standard throughout textbooks. First, I look at the pH and I decide if the patient is acidotic or alkalotic. The second step is to determine the primary problem. Is the problem related to CO2 or bicarbonate? The third step is to do the anion gap. You don't necessarily have to do this as step 3, but I've found that if I don't do it immediately as I do an initial review of a blood gas, that I forget about it. After I do the anion gap, I use my compensation formulas to determine if there's a secondary problem. And finally, in the case of an anion gap acidosis, I do the delta gap or the delta ratio. I've found this is the most problematic topic to teach because people are intimidated by it, but I believe it's because it's taught poorly. It's actually quite simple. It's important to have normal values in your head and not to use ranges of normal values. The reason I pick normal values is because we get used to problems in blood gas results and we forget how physiologically off they are. For example, if I were to hold my breath for 1 minute, my CO2 would be 46 and my pH would be 7.32. So if I would look at an ABG of myself holding my breath for 1 minute, it wouldn't look that off, and most people wouldn't think much of it. However, if you were to hold your breath for a minute, you would realize very rapidly that it is not normal and that you feel absolutely horrible. And so I like to use straight values to highlight the problems of a patient, even when they're subtle. And the second is that it makes interpretation somewhat easier. Nomenclature is also important. pH backslash CO2 backslash PO2 backslash bicarb. I review that just so everybody's on the same page. Finally, anion gap equation is in the bottom right. Sodium minus chloride minus bicarb with a normal value being under 12. The first step in my stepwise approach to blood gases is to determine the primary disorder. Acidotic patients either have high CO2, which would be a respiratory acidosis, or a low bicarb. I put in here higher or lower than it should be, and that idea of comparing things to what they are expected to be is core to blood gas interpretation, and so I try to make it part of my constant verbiage and the way I talk about these things. So a high CO2 causes acidosis and a low bicarb causes acidosis. Alkalosis, on the other hand, is backwards. If you breathe off CO2, you become alkalotic. And if your bicarb accumulates, you become alkalotic. Whenever I talk about compensation, I'll reiterate that I compare actual to expected. When I talk about compensation, I find it much easier to say that there is a secondary problem, not that a patient is over or under compensated. As an example, if the CO2 is higher than it should be by your compensation ratio, you have a respiratory acidosis. And that is even if the absolute value would suggest a respiratory alkalosis. So you can in fact have a secondary respiratory acidosis with a CO2 of 32 or 34, a low CO2. Similarly, if the bicarb is lower than it should be, you have a metabolic acidosis, even if the bicarb is higher than it should be. So really, you're always comparing actual values to what you expect them to be. There are several compensation ratios that are critical to memorize. There are different formulas you can use to calculate these ratios, and those formulas work out with the same math. I, however, find it most useful and easy to memorize and utilize on rounds to do expected changes, as in use the ratio. For metabolic acidosis, the expected change in CO2 equals the change in bicarb times 1.3. So if your bicarb is 20, that is 4 lower than it should be. 4 times 1.3 is about 5, and so your expected change in CO2 is 5. In the case of metabolic acidosis, you would want to breathe off the CO2, and so the expected change in CO2 is minus 5. For metabolic alkalosis, the expected change in CO2 is the change in bicarb times 0.6. Some textbooks or articles will put this as at 0.7, and I've even seen bicarb times 0.8 before, but the most common one is 0.6. So if your bicarb is 30, it's up 6 from a normal value of 24. 6 times 0.6 is 3.6, and your expected change in CO2 is about 3.5. In this case, if you have a metabolic alkalosis, you would be expected to let the CO2 rise a bit. And if you let it rise about 3.5, your expected CO2 is 43.5. Here's another example. pH 7.3 with a CO2 of 32, a PaO2 that we don't care about, and a bicarb of 18 with a normal anion gap. So the primary underlying problem here is acidosis, and it looks like the bicarb is low, so it's a metabolic acidosis. That low CO2 would give you alkalosis, so I know that's not the primary problem. If the anion gap's normal, I move on to compensation ratios. So the expected delta CO2 for metabolic acidosis is the change in bicarb times 1.3. Here we have a change in bicarb of 6. 6 times 1.3 is about 8, and so we expect the CO2 to change by 8. In this case, you'd want to breathe off CO2 and compensate, and so your expected CO2 is 32. If the actual is any higher than 32, you have a secondary respiratory acidosis. The CO2 is higher than it should be, even if the absolute value is normal. If the actual CO2 is 26, it's lower than it should be, and you have a secondary respiratory alkalosis over your metabolic acidosis. For respiratory problems, things get a bit more complex, and they get more complex because there's an acute equilibration between bicarb and CO2 with the carbonic anhydrase enzyme. But there's also a chronic compensation that happens related to chloride and bicarb management at the level of the kidney. That takes several days. And so we change compensation ratios for respiratory problems into acute problems and chronic problems. For an acute respiratory acidosis, the expected change in bicarb equals the change in CO2 times 1. But the change in CO2 in this case is for every 10 change in CO2. As an example, if your CO2 is 50, your expected change in bicarb equals 1 times 1. So it's for every 10 CO2 change. For a chronic respiratory acidosis, the expected change in bicarb equals the change in CO2 for every 10 CO2 times 4. In the same example here, if the CO2 is 50, we'd have 1 unit of CO2 up, so 10, and 1 times 4 equals 4, and the expected change in bicarb then is 4. For respiratory acidosis, we'd want the bicarb to make you alkalotic, and so the bicarb would go up 4, or equal 28. For respiratory alkalosis, it's 2 and 5 times the CO2 difference in, again, units of 10 CO2. To help me remember these somewhat annoying formulas, I frequently say the mantra 1425, 1425, 1425. And if you say that enough times, it becomes fairly easy to memorize and think through. For every 10 in CO2, your bicarb should change 1425, 1425. Repeat that a few times in your head, and you'll find it easy to remember in the future. Here's an example, an acute problem with a pH of 7.32 and a CO2 of 50. What we expect the bicarb to change is 1 times the change in CO2 for every 10. Here we have 10 up, so 1 times 1 equals 1, and the expected bicarb change is 25, or 1 up from a normal value of 24. If the bicarb is 20, you have a secondary metabolic acidosis overlying your respiratory acidosis, or you have a double acidosis. And if the bicarb is 30, you have a secondary metabolic alkalosis. It's higher than it should be. Now finally, on to the last step. If you have a positive anion gap, you have to do the delta ratio. And while everything you read about the delta ratio is fairly complex, the delta ratio is really simple, and it can be summed up by the simple statement that the body loves electroneutrality. Anions are negative and bicarbonate is negative. So if one goes up, the other must go down to maintain electroneutrality. The compensation ratio for changes in anion gap are fairly straightforward. The expected change in bicarb equals the change in anion gap above 12, but in the opposite direction, so it's -1. So if your anion gap is 18, that's 6 above 12, and your expected change in bicarb is -6. So your bicarb should equal 18. That's your expected bicarb. If the bicarb is different than that, you have a bicarbonate problem in addition to your anion problem. I've included a citation on the bottom. It's not from a high-level journal, but it's a fantastic review of a simplified delta gap ratio that I use. Again, the delta ratio is summed up simply by electroneutrality. Bicarb is negative, anions are negative. If one goes up, the other goes down. If the anion gap is 20, that's 8 above 12. And so we expect the bicarb to go down 8 since the anion gap is up 8. And the expected bicarb in that situation is 16. If it's 24, it's higher than it should be, and you have a metabolic alkalosis in addition to your anion gap acidosis. Now, anions are negative, so if they're up, you always have an anion gap acidosis. Now, on to practice questions. These are all real patients. They're not perfect, but I tried to pick patients that more or less fit the math, or at least fit a clinical situation I could explain. The first one is a 47-year-old patient with COPD and a perforated gastric ulcer. His labs are listed there, and the pH, CO2, PO2, and bicarbonate are listed on the bottom. I won't click through the slides for you. I will simply give a moment here, and the answer will be on the next slide. So pause the presentation if you would like a moment to go through this. If we do our stepwise approach to practice question number 1, we know that pH of 7.43 is high, and even though it's in that normal range, I like to use exact numbers, and so this is an alkalosis. When I look at the CO2 and the bicarbonate, I see that the CO2 is high, which should give you an acidosis, and so I know this is not a respiratory problem. And if I look at the bicarb, it's high, and the patient's alkalotic, so this is a metabolic primary problem. If I do the math on the anion gap, it's normal, and so we're left with simpler compensation ratios. For metabolic alkalosis, the expected change in CO2 is 12. So the expected CO2 is 52. And this is from that math equation. The expected change in CO2 is 0.6 times the change in bicarb. In this case, the bicarb is up 20 points. 20 times 0.6 is 12. We expect the CO2 in an alkalotic situation to go up to compensate for the metabolic alkalosis. So I expect the CO2 to be up 12 and equal 52. In this case, the CO2 equals 65, and so I have a secondary respiratory acidosis. I am not overcompensated. It is a secondary problem. And since there's no anion gap, I don't need to do a delta ratio, and I have all the information I need to say this is a primary metabolic alkalosis with a secondary respiratory acidosis. The reason that I have this as the first teaching point is to drive home the following. If your pH is normal or almost normal with an abnormal CO2 or bicarb, you always have two problems. So if the CO2 is way off but the pH is fine, you have two problems. Second patient has diarrhea. Labs are listed there with the ABG below. Again, why don't you pause presentation and work through the stepwise approach to blood gases. In this case, our pH is low, so we have acidosis. The CO2 is low, which would give you an alkalosis, so that's not the problem. And the bicarb is low, which would give you an acidosis, and so we know we have a primary metabolic acidosis. The anion gap's normal, so I don't have to do that annoying delta ratio. We just have to do a compensation formula. In this case, the expected change in CO2 equals 1.3 times the change in bicarb. In this case, the bicarbonate is down to 9 from 24, so that's 15. 15 times 1.3 equals 20. And so I expect the CO2 to be down 20. In this case, the expected CO2 is 20, the actual is 19. That's very close. And so this is an appropriately compensated metabolic acidosis. I bring up this slide to say that an appropriate compensation does not get you to a normal pH. Compensation doesn't fix you. It just gets you less dead. The third question is a lot more complex of a patient, and I won't go into the long description of why Graves or a thyroid crisis, in addition to an ileostomy that is taken from the intestine and therefore excretes bicarb. I won't go into the depth of why this patient has the problem they have. But here we have labs that show a low pH and a high anion gap. Here, the CO2 is under 40, so I know certainly the primary problem is not respiratory acidosis, but it's a bicarbonate problem. The bicarb is down. And so acidosis, and the primary problem is a metabolic process. I'd like to highlight that a metabolic acidosis, when you get to that second step of identifying the primary condition, does not tell you whether the problem is related to bicarb or due to an anion. All you know is that it's either bicarb or an anion, and that's where the delta ratio comes in. In this case, the anion gap is 26, and that's 14 higher than it should be. And so we know we have a primary metabolic acidosis, we know we have an anion gap acidosis, and we need to figure out if the bicarb is what it should be for that degree of anion, or if there's a different problem. But before we do that, let's start at the beginning and do the metabolic acidosis compensation ratio. In this situation, the expected change in CO2 would equal the change in bicarb, which is 8, 24 minus 16, times 1.3. That equals 10. So our expected CO2 is 30. But that's not what we see. We see 35. And so in this case, the patient's CO2, even though it's less than 40, is higher than it should be. And anytime we have a value that's higher than it should be, we have a problem. In this case, it's a secondary respiratory acidosis. So now we've identified two problems, a primary metabolic acidosis and a secondary respiratory acidosis. Now we need to determine if it's just an anion problem or a bicarbonate problem too. And that's where we use our delta ratio. It doesn't take up much space, so despite all your fear about the delta ratio, you're seeing that it's not all that hard. In this case, our expected delta bicarb for that high of an anion gap is minus 14. Again, the body likes electroneutrality. If the anions are up 14 from 12, the bicarb should be down 14. And in this case then, the expected bicarb is 10. 24 minus 14. The actual bicarb is 16. So the actual bicarb is higher than it should be. It's 16 even though it should be 10. And when you have a problem that's higher than it should be, or an expected value that's different than an actual value, you have a problem. And in this case, you have a metabolic alkalosis. Happens to be because the ileostomy secretes chloride occasionally and gives you a metabolic alkalosis. Our next practice question is a weak patient with polyuria, anorexia, and weight loss. Labs are shown there. Pause the talk if you'd like to work this through on your own, which I highly encourage. In this case, we have a low pH. The CO2 is low, so that does not explain acidosis, and the bicarb's low. So we know the primary problem is a metabolic acidosis. Our anion gap is 22, so we know we have an anion gap acidosis and that we have to do that pesky little delta ratio. If we go through our normal metabolic acidosis compensations, we expect the CO2 to change, and we expect it to change 1.3 times the change in the bicarbonate. In this case, the bicarbonate is down 12. 12 times 1.3 is about 15. And so our expected CO2 is down about 15. And in this case, that's right. So we have a compensated metabolic acidosis. Now onto the delta ratio. If the anion gap is up 10 from 12, so it's 22, the bicarb should go down 10. And so we expect the bicarb to equal 14. And the actual value is 12. This is likely appropriate and within lab error. However, the bicarb is lower than it should be, so it may be that you have a mild bicarbonate problem as well as your anion problem. But again, probably within the range of normal, which for most of these labs is plus or minus 2. Our next question is a patient who's older with diarrhea. Labs are shown there, and I encourage you to pause so that you can work this out on your own. In this case, we see that the patient is acidotic and that it's a primary bicarb problem or metabolic acidosis. The anion gap is 10, and so we don't have to do the delta ratio. Our expected change in CO2 equals 1.3 times the change in bicarb, so our expected CO2 is 25. Is minus 25. In this case, 40 minus 25 equals 15, and so this is a compensated metabolic acidosis. This is a real patient and quite a dramatic pH for an appropriate compensation in the blood gases. Our next question is a 72-year-old person with COPD, NSAID abuse, with kidney injury and pneumonia. Labs are shown down below. I did not mean to put 2 Ks there, and I apologize for that. You'll see they're acidotic, and I want you to pause this to go through the question on your own. The answer to this is that the patient is acidotic, and we see that the bicarb is low and the CO2 is high. So before we even do the math, we know that we have a dual problem. Now, which one is first? Is it a predominant respiratory problem or bicarb problem? There are fancy ways to work that out, but I like the rule of 10 to 10. And that rule of thumb is to say the pH should change 0.08 or 0.1, 10, for every change in CO2 of 10 for a respiratory problem. So here, the CO2 is up 10, and the pH drop from that should bring you to 7.32. But you know that the pH is down a lot more than 0.08. It's down 0.3. And so we understand in this case the problem is a primary metabolic problem with a secondary respiratory acidosis. Our next practice question is a 42-year-old with a psychiatric history but little other data. Labs are shown there with profound acidosis. Give the talk a pause and work it through on your own. Here we see that the bicarb is low when you have a primary metabolic acidosis. When you do your anion gap calculation, patient also has an extremely high anion gap. In our compensation ratios, we see that our expected change in CO2 equals 1.3 times the change in bicarb. In this case, the change in bicarb is 24 minus 8, or 16. 1.3 times 16 equals 21. So our expected CO2 is 40 minus 21, or about 19 or 20. And in this case, the CO2 is much higher than it should be. So this is secondary respiratory acidosis. Now, since we have a high anion gap, we have to do the delta ratio. Here, the anion gap is 28, or it's up 16 from where it should be. So the expected bicarb is in the opposite direction. And we expect the bicarb to be 24 minus 16, or 8. In this case, we have a normal delta ratio. And so the anion gap is the problem, not the bicarbonate. I don't remember what this patient ingested, but this was an ingestion of something. Our next practice question is a patient with diabetes, CKD with a kidney and pancreas transplant, and bronchiectasis, and lung problems. Labs are shown there, and again, an acidosis. Here we have a primary metabolic acidosis with a normal anion gap. And our compensation ratio is as follows. Our expected change in CO2 equals 1.3 times the change in bicarb, which here is 12. So our expected CO2 after that math is done is 25. The actual is 37. So in this case, we have a secondary respiratory acidosis. Finally, the last practice question, I encourage you to work through on your own, but I've included the answer here for you. It's a patient with end-stage liver disease and acute liver failure with diabetes, smoking, and hypertension. They presented with a slightly elevated anion gap acidosis and an alkalotic pH. And in this case, I called this a primary respiratory alkalosis. I did the anion gap and saw they have an anion gap acidosis. And then the compensation ratio, if I think that this is an acute problem or an acute respiratory alkalosis, I expect the bicarb to change 2 times the change in CO2 for every 10 in CO2. In this case, the CO2 is down 18 or 1.8. 1.8 times 2 is 3.6. So I expect the bicarb to equal about 20. And in this case, it does. So this is a compensated respiratory alkalosis. Now, for the bicarbonate, we expect the bicarbonate to be down 1 since the anion gap is up 1. So I expect the bicarbonate to be 23, but it's low. It's 19. And so this delta gap shows that the problem is a bicarbonate related acidosis. So in this situation, we have an anion gap acidosis, a bicarbonate related acidosis, and a respiratory alkalosis. The remainder of these are practice questions you can work through on your own. I did not include the answers, but they're real patients and the answers should be straightforward. You can pause in between each so that you can work the questions through.